right. Excited to be here. Boy, there's a lot of you. That's fine. We'll do this anyway. As a kid, I knew a lot of people who lived painful, tragic lives. But I thought I was an anomaly. People close to me were raped, molested, and beaten by parents, spouses, and family friends. They were addicted to alcohol, meth, cocaine, and God knows what else. They went hungry and lived in filth. They were orphaned, abandoned, neglected, and imprisoned, willing to do almost anything to feel alive, including overdose. They lived hard lives, where their daily experience was either acute suffering or prolonged numbness. Now, I assumed that I was an anomaly. My experience was an anomaly as a kid. I assumed that outside my circle, I would discover that most adults lived fairly pleasant lives. Not perfect lives, not without difficulties or complexities or accidents, but generally pleasant lives. A good job, a fulfilling marriage, an exciting sex life, a photogenic family, a sense of accomplishment, a new phone, not too much debt, reasonably good health, very Christian, a pleasant, normal life. I didn't believe that I was owed any of this, but my sense of the world and of God was that if I put in the work and I honored God with my life, none of these good things were out of reach because they were normal. As I grew older, there were very few signs that I saw that I was wrong about what normal looked like. I met lots of other people, and they mostly seemed to be pretty happy. They would greet me with warm smiles and conversations, and the ones who had hard lives tended to choose that suffering or tended not to be Christian, or at least not good Christians. They were choosing to be miserable or depressed or whatever it was. And I would think, if they just made better choices, if they just were a bit more disciplined, they wouldn't have to suffer like this. You can really walk around like this for a long time, thinking nonsense like this. Thinking that most adults have it together and live pleasant lives. And that the ones who don't have it together probably only have themselves to blame. In fact, it's not hard to think like this, even when you grow up around suffering as I did. It's hard not to think like this because almost no one wants to tell you otherwise. We each try to hide our own scars from each other, even to those closest to us. And almost every cultural institution, be it church or government or corporation, promises you a good life if you just do what they ask. Make the right life choices, marry the right person, go to the right church, get the right education, work the right job, buy the right products. And whatever challenges we face in life can be solved. That's our society's promise. Whatever you face in life, someone has developed a method for fixing it, for beating it. There's a pill, there's a program, there's a devotional, there's a diet, there's an app, there's a candidate, which means that if you don't fix it, if you don't beat it, it's your fault. You really should have tried harder. Normal life is a pleasant life. Well, I'm here to confess to you that I was very wrong. That I was not an anomaly. I was the norm. And I want you to understand what that means. In my life, I've witnessed a massive change in how Christians talk about mental health. And for the most part, this has been a very good thing. Mental illness therapy, psychologist, medication, all of these were treated with suspicion in the churches I attended. Christians don't use antidepressants, they repent of sin. They don't take anxiety meds, they learn to be anxious for nothing. Psychologists were seen as godless, false counselors. Now, maybe I'm just attending better churches, but my sense is that the American Christians have mostly moved beyond this kind of mindset. Thank God, quite literally. In fact, mental health has lost so much of its stigma that it is not uncommon for people to post honest confessions about their mental health on social media. But for all this openness, I think that for most people, mental illness remains hidden. Sure, some people are talking about mental health quite loudly and openly, but the day-to-day experience of adult life has not changed much. To quote Virgil, we each suffer our own ghosts, and mostly alone. Get to know someone really well, and almost without fail, you will discover a person who routinely struggles to get out of bed. And not just because they're tired. I know you're all feeling that this time of the semester. They can't get out of bed because once they step foot on the floor, they will be launched out into a day that is uncertain and lifeless and in some ways impossible. Or you will discover someone who suffers panic attacks every time there's another mass shooting. Or someone who cannot stop obsessing over how they have failed as a Christian, or as a student, or as a boyfriend or girlfriend. Or someone who cannot eat or cannot stop eating because of the misplaced guilt they feel from being sexually assaulted. Or maybe someone who is stuck in the habit of living even though they feel terribly alone and bored. Hear me, none of this is abnormal. It's not right, but it's not abnormal. It's not an anomaly. That's what I discovered once I started to really know people around me. And most of these people will not show signs of the despair that follows them around, or at least these signs will be exceptionally subtle. They might surface in a vague prayer request, sudden moodiness, a tendency towards distracting addictions like social media or porn or video games, but mostly they are what I would call high-functioning adults. We may go through periods where our functioning breaks down, and we stare blankly at our email box or delete whatever, or debate whether to get out of bed, or we feel we can't physically move, but for the most part, most of the time, we function. We get up, we work, we buy things, we're entertained, we're stimulated, and then we sleep. But it's there, waiting for us, waiting for the right moment to assert itself. Living in a society governed by technique makes us think that life is easier than ever. Technique, if you don't know, is the use of a rational method to maximize efficiency, and it's everywhere in our society. Scientifically proven methods for dating, studying, reading the Bible, budgeting, sleeping, and losing weight. The promise of technique is that we are collectively overcoming all the challenges to life through research, through technology, and through discipline. All you have to do is find the right self-help book, the right life hack, app, or Bible study. And that's exactly why technique's promise that life is easier than ever becomes just another source of dread. If life doesn't have to be this hard, if there are answers to all my problems, then it's really my fault that I'm overwhelmed or a failure. But what if our contemporary society is not actually built for us, for humans, as God designed us? If that is the case, then sometimes anxiety and depression will be a rational and even moral response to a fundamentally broken and disordered society. Regardless of the causes, contemporary life is marked by widespread psychological and spiritual despair and the sense that answers are available, particularly through proper mental health. And I could quote you statistics on that, but you'll just have to trust me. There is a danger, however, I want to say, in relying too heavily on the language of of mental health. I'm not going to argue that psychology or psychiatry are godless fields and you just need to pray harder. There's great value in both fields, and I have personally benefited from them. And this is the place in the talk where I share my personal psychological history to establish my credibility for my composition students. It's ethos, but I'm not going to do that because it's none of your business. So, if you know, you know. I just want you to understand that I'm not opposed, and I don't want you to be opposed to counseling or medication. They absolutely have proper uses, and they're very, very valuable. My fear is, though, that sometimes medical language obscures the very thing it's supposed to be treating. Sometimes getting a diagnosis puts your mental suffering into a nice, tidy little box. See, the unknown is a lot more frightening than the known, and so it can be a great relief to get a diagnosis. If there is a diagnosis, there must be a treatment, surely. And with a diagnosis, we can objectify our suffering. We can set it on a table and examine it, communicate it to others. I am not depressed, I have depression. It is over there, and I am here. I can contain my illness because I can name it. My experience has a listing in the DSM-5, so maybe it's manageable after all. But if you've been to counseling for an extended period of time, or you've been medically treated for a disorder, you know that such simple, concrete answers are few and far between because the mind is wonderfully complex. The best mental health professionals are not scientists who offer precise, scientifically objective diagnoses, but perpetual students of the human heart and soul. They do not provide categorical and rational explanations for your suffering, but they intuit with wisdom and compassion. They offer a sympathetic ear and wise counsel, but rarely anything approaching a cure. And psychiatrists can sometimes prescribe medications that do help lessen your suffering, but disturbingly, we don't always know how or why antidepressants work. And some drugs seem to have a higher likelihood of producing terrible side effects than doing the one thing they are supposed to do. They had one job, and they failed. When you realize all of this, it's not hard to fall back into despair, to feel alone and helpless. Normal people go on with their pleasant lives, and here you are, stuck to the wall with a pin. Let me be very clear, if you are suffering, please get professional help. And we have a wonderful counseling services here at OBU, which I often recommend to students. But I want you to accept two facts. First, life is hard. And during some periods, it will feel all but unbearably hard. Life can be so difficult and painful and boring that you cannot comprehend it right now unless you are in it. Even if you've experienced these seasons in the past, you almost certainly cannot remember them accurately right now. You might be able to remember the dates when you missed class because of depression, but that experience of the depression remains inaccessible to us unless it returns in force. For all of human history, we have known this truth. Human experience involves great suffering, great tragedy. But it's hard to recall this truth when we're surrounded by forces that promise us greater and greater ease and freedom and control over our lives. So remember, tremendous suffering is the normal experience of being in the world, not the anomaly. Beauty and love and joy are also normal, but also suffering. Second, there are rarely clear, definitive answers to depression, anxiety, and other disorders. You can and should pursue professional help, but just remember that there are limits. Your counseling session will end. Your medication will do no more. And at those limits, you are thrown back on yourself, on God, and your neighbor. All the counseling and medication in the world cannot replace the existential decision to live and rely on God and your neighbor. Professional help can guide you and medications can assist you, but in the end, it is always just you and God and your neighbor and the choice to act, which at root is the choice to worship. And that's okay. It really is. It's even beautiful. Which brings me to the point of all this. What does it mean to live? We quite rightly hear regular appeals for people who are struggling with suicidal ideation to get help. But there remains a question of what it means to live. Why is it meaningful and good to live? You need to know that your being in the world is a witness. It testifies. There is no avoiding this fact. All we can do is decide what our existence is a witness to, and how we can share that burden of witnessing. Life will, at some point, inevitably crush you, and it's normal. And your response to that suffering will testify to something. There will be times when you will be convinced that life is not worth living and that existence is burdensome and meaningless, even as a Christian. When those times come, your duty is to acknowledge the objective reality that life is good, and that despite our distress, we must get up and carry on. Your existence is a testament, a living argument, an affirmation of creation itself. When you get out of bed each morning, that act is a faint but real echo of God's "it is good." Rising out of bed is also a decisive act. Living is a gamble. It's a severe gamble. You do not know the suffering and sorrow that awaits you. You don't know the heartache that's coming. But you know that it is coming for you, eventually. Of that, history and literature have testified without counterclaim. To choose to go on is to proclaim with your life, and at the risk of tremendous suffering, that it is good. Even when it's hard, it is good. Life is an awesome responsibility and a burden. Like it or not, if you give up on life, it will open up the possibility for others to give up. You have the solemn responsibility to bear witness to the goodness of life by living despite suffering, despite the fact that the pleasant life isn't actually normal. But hear this, life is a gift, and as it turns out, the greatest gifts are always also burdens. Love, children, wisdom, beauty, salvation. Our being is a result of the gratuitous love of God. And we honor that gift by participating fully in it, even when participating in life feels unbearable. Now, none of this is to imply that suicidal ideation and depression are trivial matters that we can just pray away or will to disappear, but it does mean that for Christians who understand that existence is an essential act of God's love for us, suicide is not an imaginable option. It's just not. We can admit that we and many others have struggled and will continue to struggle with suicidal ideation. Some thorns in the flesh will not come out this side of paradise. But part of facing despair is knowing how we can respond. And if our life is a witness to the goodness of creation, and it is, and therefore the goodness of the Creator, ending your life can never be a possibility. No matter how strongly you feel dread or alienation or fear, we have an obligation to live according to the truth that this life is a miraculous gift. I understand that what I am speaking of is painful and difficult, and yet this is our calling, to glorify God by honoring His creation, which is, in part, you. And in so doing, you honor your neighbor's life as well. When you cannot believe that existence is a sacred gift from God, when you can no longer even believe that in the objective goodness of other people's lives, then what I need you to do is surrender to the grace of your neighbors, particularly in the church. You must learn to accept their wise love for you, their words of assurance, which may not heal you, but they can carry you when you are incapable of carrying yourself. Sometimes your duty is simply to trust and rely on the love of others, to let them bear you up. Ultimately, the only reason to keep living is if you live unto God. If His word is true, then we were divinely created to glorify Him and enjoy Him always, and our creation was a fundamentally good act. The only other reasons to live are for the world or the flesh, and they only want you to live insofar as you are useful to them. Once you stop being productive and your credit dries up and you can no longer buy or produce stuff, the world does not care if you are alive, unless you're being a drain on the economy, in which case the world would politely ask you to stop and go away. When your body primarily experiences pain rather than pleasure, your flesh has no reason to stay alive. When sex loses its thrill and you've come to the end of porn and entertainment all bores you, when your quality of life is diminished by mental illness or physical ailment, when you cease to believe that you'll ever not be alone, then assisted suicide seems reasonable and moral because you're no longer useful to your flesh. Usefulness is the sole criterion for the world and the flesh. But you have no use value to God. You can't. There's nothing He needs. You can't cease being useful to God because you were never useful to God to begin with. That's simply not why He created you and why He continues to sustain you. It was gratuitous. He made us just because He loves us, just for His own good pleasure. Every other reason to live demands that you remain useful, and one day your use will run out. One day you won't be good enough, successful enough or attractive enough to be useful, and that will be it. But not so with God. To God, your existence in his universe is an act of creation, and it remains good as creation, even in its fallen state. We all suffer silent crises, carrying burdens that are utterly invisible to those closest to us, and occasionally opaque to ourselves. But it is good. Even when we can't feel it, life remains good. While suffering is a normal part of human life, hear this, it is not the essence. At the center of existence is not suffering, but grace. The grace of Christ. The grace that cleanses you from all unrighteousness and provides food and beauty in this world and created you. That same God who sent his son to die for you sustains your existence and created you, you miraculous you, because he loves you, whether you feel it or not. Now, we're going to forget this fact many times throughout our lives. So the task before us is to hold each other up, to remind one another of the truth that is truer than our deepest misery, to attend to the gifts God has given us. Despite the comforts of contemporary life and its promises of ever greater peace, life is terribly hard, and pleasant isn't normal. And while we may hesitate to call getting out of bed courageous, it seems to me undeniably true that day-to-day life demands a great deal of courage. And that courage speaks loudly. It confesses the nature of creation and of God. It is our burden and it is our gift. It is your spiritual act of worship, presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice. And when you cannot get up, I need you to let someone else carry you, knowing that in due time you will be called upon to do the same. Christ's body here on earth is one of his mercies to us, and it is the only way we can make it through. Thank you.